I'm John Mattison. What will get South Africa back on track? This week we'll talk to a former journalist who took a deep dive into what's going on at South African Airways. And later to the author of a new book on Frederik Van Zyl Slubbert, once one of the most exciting politicians in the country. But my first guest is Kaiser Nyachumba. Kaiser's had a rich career. He was former editor of the Daily News in Durban and the Independent on Saturday. He then left journalism. He's got a degree from Georgetown University in the United States and a master's in business administration in the UK. He's now CEO of the Steel and Industries Federation of South Africa. And his new book is Successfully Implementing Turnaround Strategies in State-Owned Companies. Welcome, Kaiser.
Thank you very much, John. I appreciate it.
Kaiser, before we get into the sorry tale of SAA, you got to investigate an African success story, Ethiopian Airlines. And the first interesting thing about it is that it's government owned, and yet it's successful. What did you find?
Well, what I found was that Ethiopian Airlines, from its founding, was allowed to operate as a corporate entity. The word used by the deputy chairman of the board is that it has unofficial corporate independence. And so from the moment when that airline was established in partnership with the old American airline TWA, it was allowed to function as a corporate entity and not as a government department. And it made decisions along corporate lines and was not run, again, as I said, like a government department. And so it is, in fact, it has become over the years the first airline in Africa that now benchmarks itself not against SAA, not against Egypt Air, not against Kenyan Airways, but against Singapore Airlines, against Lufthansa, and against international airlines like those. It has been very professionally run, and the management team has been allowed to make all the necessary decisions that have needed to be made to ensure that it is profitable.
So it's government owned, but one of the things I got from your book is they know they can't get a bailout. The government will not give them money, so they stand or fall on their own.
That is a very important point. It is indeed true. The government has not had the financial wherewithal to bail that airline out, and that is why it was required from day one to be self-sufficient. Save for the injection of capital from TWA, there was a partner. Once TWA exited that partnership, the airline had to ensure that it makes enough money to be sustainable. And so it has not been bailed out once, and it has been profitable for years. And in the past 20 years, it has had only 2 CEOs. Unlike South African Airways, that has had since 2000 has had 11 CEOs, most of whom have been acting. So there's been stability there, and it has been very strategic in delivering on its objectives, and it has been allowed to run as a corporate entity, albeit government owned.
Now, it's interesting, just on that point, you interviewed some experts who said it's got to be privatized, SAA, it's the only way to go. But then, of course, you found Ethiopian defied that logic, and the issue wasn't necessarily ownership. It was the culture of the corporation and the culture of the shareholder.
The shareholder disposition, as I would call it, is absolutely critical. It isn't, as many argue, the fact that it is government owned. In South Africa, that is very much the case, but the ownership type is not in and of itself important. It is whether the owner enables an entity to be run along corporate lines. Does the owner take a hands-off approach, appoint a board made up of individuals with expertise in certain areas, and does the board itself, in turn, delegate sufficiently to the CEO and the team to run the operation? So you're right, Singapore Airlines is state-owned, although there's a certain degree of private ownership now, and Air New Zealand was 100% state-owned, and much comparison has been made by some of the people that I interviewed between Air New Zealand, that is at the end of, that also has the same challenges as SAA, end of hemisphere, not much traffic in the area, and it needed to be reliant and do well. So it is not whether or not it is privately owned or state-owned, because as I've said, as you've indicated, Ethiopian Airlines has been privately owned, state-owned. It is whether the owner allows the entity to be run along professional lines. Is the owner intrusive and interfering, as has been the case here? So the challenge that both SAA and other state-owned companies have had in South Africa, frankly, has been the African National Congress government. They have not been able to take a view that these are strategic enterprises that should be allowed to compete freely in the market, whether they have competitors or they do not, as in the case of ESCOM or SABC to an extent. They have not enabled the state-owned enterprises to compete without any interference. And it is worse in the case of SAA because, as you know, John, there is so much competition in this sector. This started in the US in 1978 when President Jimmy Carter introduced the Airline Deregulation Act that made it possible for competition to take place and allowed low-cost carriers or low-fare airlines to enter the market and bring down the cost of travel. We then had in South Africa a similar piece of legislation passed in 1991. And so there's so much competition in the domestic market, not to mention internationally, that the SAA faces. And yet it is not able to operate in a manner that a business in a competitive space like that should operate.
I want to come back to SAA in a minute, but a couple more quick points about Ethiopian Airlines. I mean, the Ethiopians, the country and the owners and the workers are willing to sacrifice because they're so proud of Ethiopian Airlines. One of their aims was to beat SAA, and they really did.
That is true. Maurice Kiruga, a business observer in Nairobi that I interviewed, made the point that actually Ethiopia is very different in many ways. It enables, among other things, its state-owned enterprises, especially the airline, to be run along business lines. And you're absolutely right, the CEO of Ethiopian Airlines does not get paid half what the CEO of SAA get paid. They have a culture where for them, it's service that is being rendered. They derive a lot of pride from seeing the national carrier of that country doing so well. And so the salaries are not where they are. The level of unionization is not where it is in the case of SAA or indeed in the case of Kenyan Airways. So very, very different indeed.
And one of the other things I learned is that their success has been so great that they now own shares in Malawi, a Guinean airline, a Chad airline, and West African. So they really have become the giant of Africa, and we are really left way behind.
No, that is absolutely true. They had a strategy well thought out. They called it Vision 2015, and then their Vision 2025, and they were able to achieve that strategy. The strategy sought to see that airline grow phenomenally and conquer Africa, and then also ensure that it is over time a real competitor to Asian airlines like Emirates and the others. And in Africa now, it has a physical presence in very many countries, including in Southern Africa through a stake in LAM in Mozambique, and through, in fact, they own the majority shares in Air Malawi. So if you fly from Johannesburg to Ethiopia, you now have a choice of either flying directly on Ethiopian Airlines to Addis Ababa, or you can fly via Malawi, and the long way you then proceed from there to either Kenya or directly to Ethiopia. So yeah, they own so many airlines. They were very able to implement successfully a strategy that at some stage SAA itself had. SAA wanted to have a presence in East Africa, in West Africa, and they wanted to ensure that they have a partnership with Air Nigeria, which existed in name only. They failed to deliver on that strategy, and Ethiopian Airlines stole a march on them. And so now they're almost everywhere in the continent, and there's no part of the continent to which Ethiopian Airlines, either directly or through the airlines with which it is in partnership, does not fly.
And now we're going to have to carry on this conversation after the break, but I did want to ask you, I noticed from your book that Ethiopian Airlines was brought in to consider buying a stake in SAA because they've been doing it all over Africa, and there were 3 reasons why they said no.
That is true. Ethiopian Airlines has been courted for some time now by the government in South Africa, but it has itself, as part of its strategy, thought it would make sense to enter into a partnership with SAA, either to buy a stake, a majority stake in SAA, or to to be allowed to run SAA. But it did not happen. And indeed, the efforts by Minister Pravin Gordhan, notwithstanding, to bring them on board, EAL, as I call it, Ethiopian Airlines, arrived independently at the conclusion that it would make no sense to enter into such a partnership with SAA or to buy equity in SAA because of the degree of political interference, because also of the non-alignment among key ministers, the Minister of Public Enterprises wanting the airline to continue to be publicly owned, and the Minister of Finance in the person of Tito Mboweni talking the airline down and insisting that it should be offloaded. And so there is the absence of the alignment was one of the factors that worried Ethiopian Airlines. Another issue was the degree of corruption that took place there, and the fact that in Ethiopian Airlines' view, there was not the degree of expertise that needed to exist at SAA, and that is true. Whether I spoke to board members of SAA or the CEO, Vianney Jahan, and other executives, and indeed some of the shareholder representatives, they all agreed that SAA had over the years been denuded of expertise.
We have to take a break, but we're going to follow up on this when we come back. We're talking to Kaiser Nyachumba. And we're back talking to Kaiser Nyachumba about his research into why SAA has gone downhill, but other African airlines, even the Ethiopian Airlines, which is owned by government, has overtaken us by a country mile. Kaiser, welcome back.
Thank you.
Just looking at SAA's performance, its last profit was in 2011. One estimate is that the government has put in something like, or committed something like 58 billion rand since 1999, I think it is. It's only made a profit in 3 out of the last 14 years. This is a really terrible record.
That is absolutely true. It's shocking. But as I argue, or as I discovered, much of that is attributable directly to the government. Firstly, you need to ensure that you have aircraft that are very, very reliable in terms of consumption of fuel. SAA, even when it was still owned by Transnet, and especially after 2007 when it was set free, while it was very poorly capitalized, true, it relied on very antiquated aircraft that were very heavy on fuel consumption. And so it could not compete either when it came to fuel efficiency, nor could it compete when it came to price. Because it cost so much to operate, it consumed so much fuel, its prices had to be higher. To fly from here to London or Germany, you paid much more than you would if you flew any of SAA's competitors. So it was not competitive. Then the other thing was that it was never properly capitalized. It was required to put in place efforts to turn itself around, but was not given the necessary financial and other wherewithal to be able to do that. And we've had a heavy level of interference by government with various people who are ministers. And then you then have the PFMA, which we understand in a country such as ours is a very crucial piece of legislation to ensure that when the procurement takes place, it takes place in accordance with that piece of law, that piece of legislation. But in an industry like in the aviation industry, it's very important for decisions to be made speedily. So agility is of the essence. The existence of the PFMA in the case of SAA had the effect of hobbling that airline. It required that the board takes decisions and then sends these as recommendations to the shareholder minister, who has 30 days within which to come back to the board. And then often the ministers did not even come back to the board within the 30-day period. If sometimes they didn't even make decisions at all. When in the case of Ethiopian Airlines or Kenya Airways, the board, the management team would make recommendations to the board would take decisions, and they would be able immediately to implement them. The decision-making authority were the executive team and the board. The shareholder was not involved in the process. So it was an anomaly that obtained here that made it very difficult for SAA to compete. And the various individuals one spoke to, whether they be board members or the executives, repeatedly made this particular analogy that SAA, that they were required, that they compared themselves to a boxer thrown into the ring that was required to fight in a world boxing championship, but with his hands tied behind his back. And I felt a great degree of sympathy with the SAA team. And then you had a situation where the board, about Tutumbian and others, and she wasn't the only one, she was perhaps the worst, but wasn't the only one, where some members of the board pursued their own agendas and agendas of certain factions within the ANC and did not advance the best interests of the airline. And so they, in the process, were able to sabotage effectively the airline. Hence, it ended up where it is today.
I don't want to spend too much time on Coleman Andrews, but it seems to me that when Saki Makazoma was head of Transnet, he hired Coleman Andrews, an American airline executive, or actually he wasn't an airline executive, but he was in the aviation industry. It seems to me that that was a great missed opportunity, because he wasn't the right person, but I think Saki Makazoma was sincere in his attempt to bring in the best and make it work.
You're right, and I spoke to Saki, and indeed he was sincere in his efforts, and he felt that Coleman Andrews, who ran a charter aircraft company in the airline company in the US, would be the person to turn around the airline, introduce the necessary levels of professionalism. And the people at SAA, including some who were at the Department of Public Enterprises at the time, one was the Deputy Director General and later Director General Dr. Andrew Shaw, who said there were elements of good that Coleman Andrews introduced. They said that he began to position the airline to compete internationally. But if you speak to the likes of Dr. Joaquin Verboten and others, they say without fail that he was disastrous because of the decisions that he made that saw him ensuring that a consulting firm in which his wife was a partner was intrinsically involved at SAA, and there were profits that were really not profits because they sold off. They took a critical strategic decision to sell the aircraft that SAA owned and then list those back. And that, over the years, became one of the issues that affected the airline. And so he, although there was an element of professionalism introduced into the airline, in the long term, there was more harm done to the airline than good.
It appears that, his real loyalty, it appears, was to Bain & Company, which was the consulting firm that he came from, that he was involved in with Senator Mitt Romney, now Senator Mitt Romney, but he was actually, a charter company is very different from an airline company. But I want to move on to one other quick point about SAA's problems now. Because they're in debt, when they borrow money, they pay more than other airlines. So they're competing on a non-level playing field.
Yeah, no, most certainly. You see, in terms of turnaround strategy, you need a few things in order to stand a good chance of implementing it successfully. One of those is capital. One strategy scholar compares strategy to blood in one's vein. You need, or a blood transfusion in the case of a patient who lands in hospital. That's how important it is. And SAA was poorly capitalized and did not enjoy the necessary support from the shareholder to be able to implement the strategies successfully. So it was not properly capitalized. Secondly, you need a situation where there's a CEO who's appropriately empowered to make decisions speedily in response to whatever challenge is obtained. That was something to be dreamt of at SAA for the reasons that I've stated. You had the shareholder intrinsically involved, yet board members, some board members sabotaging the leadership team. That was lacking. And you also needed a situation where there was the ability to make decisions speedily. That was lacking at SAA. So you're absolutely right, John. The problem, there are so many problems that existed at SAA that made it impossible for it to implement the turnaround strategy effectively. One of those being that it was poorly capitalized and did not have the financial wherewithal to do a number of things. Look at the long-term turnaround strategy. The long-term turnaround strategy dates back to 2013, introduced by Malusi Kigaba, and you have Vuyani Chahana comes on board. He and JB Magwaza, they make the various tweaks that they deemed appropriate, and they believe that the strategy is sound. However, in order for the strategy to be implemented successfully, 21.7 billion rand was required, and the Minister of Finance signs off on that. And that, however, they don't make the money available. When they make it available, in the words of Martin Kingston, it's in drips and drops. So it's a drip feeding thing. So that had the effect of handicapping the airline. In order to implement a turnaround strategy, you do need to focus on the core. You do need to be able to take tough decisions to sell off non-core assets. SAA could not do that. Even with airchefs, they were not allowed to sell airchefs, and it's not core. You need to be able to cut your costs to the bone through other ways, reducing the number of employees that you have. So your asset retrenchment and cost retrenchment, it must involve laying off members of staff. And the leadership of SAA, including the board, would not be allowed by the shareholder minister and the government to take those tough decisions.
Guys, I mean, just to summarize what you said, the government was giving them enough money to stay alive, but too little to succeed. We've only got a couple of minutes left, so I want to go on to back to the points you raised, which also led Ethiopian Airlines and others not to be willing to invest. And that is the political interference and level of government failure, which really goes right to the top, because it's convenient in the media to blame Dudu Myeni, who was the chairperson and, as you say, was particularly unfortunate. But really, it's just as important, or even more important, that at the top, you have the finance minister and Tito Mbayeni and the Pravin Gordhan, the Minister of Public Enterprises, who are differing with each other, and their differences in public are catastrophic. And as long as you can't get unity at the government level, you're not going to succeed.
So, absolutely. Firstly, they were not even given enough money to be operationally sound. They were just given enough money to be able to launch their annual report, submit the annual report to Parliament, and claim to be a going concern. So it was not even enough for them to be operationally sound, just to be enough to be able to claim that they were a going concern when they were not. Secondly, the point that you're making is so critical. When you have important members of a government effectively undermining an enterprise in the manner in which the finance minister did, it tells you that there is no alignment in that government. There is no leadership. Vuyani Chahana and JB Magwaza, in particular, as CEO and chairperson respectively, were very, very deeply disappointed at this. And now I have Tito Mboweni is held in high esteem. I regard him very highly as the Minister of Finance, as somebody who has an independent mind. But it was a grave error for somebody in that position to go public with his views that the airline is failing and should be sold off. Because essentially what you do, you undercut any efforts that are being made by the Minister of Public Enterprises and indeed the leadership team. The leadership team of SAA they said an airline is like a listed entity. Yes, it is not listed, but people buy, somebody takes a decision, I'm going to fly to New York on holiday or Jamaica.
You want to know the airline's going to be there in 9 months' time.
at this time. And in order to do that, they buy a ticket a year in advance or 6 months in advance. Now, if you have pronouncements such as were made by Tito Mboweni, nobody comes forward to buy a ticket in advance. So effectively, you are undermining the airline.
On that critical note, I'm afraid we have to end. I could talk to you for hours, but thank you so much, Kaiser Nyachumba. That was really useful. When we come back, we're going to be talking to Professor Albert Grundlingh, author of Slubbert, Man on a Mission. And we're back talking to Professor Albert Grundlingh, author of Slubbert, Man on a Mission. He's the retired head of the history department at Stellenbosch University. Welcome, Professor.
Hello, John.
Now, before I interviewed you, I was talking to my niece, who is a university graduate, and I asked her if she knew who Zyl Slabbert was, and she had no idea. But not that long ago, many thought him the most interesting politician in South Africa. He was leader of the opposition in the White Parliament, and of course he famously resigned and went to meet the ANC. Why did you think it important that he deserved a book?
The reason for that, I've got to go back a bit, is that I had the opportunity of going to Pig's Peak in Swaziland, where we collected, myself and some other people from the university, collected all his documents. Initially, I didn't think I'll be writing on him. I haven't done any biographies before. My main interest was kind of social history rather than political history. But steadily, as I went through the documents, a thought occurred to me. What's particularly interesting at that point for me was his academic career. Everybody's written on his political career, or he's well known for being a politician, but we get far less information on him as an academic. So that's when I started off, and then it grew on me, and I realized that there is scope for a fully fledged political biography of Slubbert.
I want to go straight into, although he never held government office, really, I suppose with the exception of some work he did in the Johannesburg Metropolitan Council, there are some things that do give him a legacy, and of course the first is Dakar. I was there. He took a group of white Afrikaners mostly to Dakar for a very important breakthrough, high-profile meeting with the ANC led by Thabo Mbeki, and it's hard to believe now, but that was a major breakthrough at the time.
Yes, I discussed the whole Dakar venture in considerable detail, and I agree with you that it was a breakthrough in the sense that it loosened the props of South African society. It became acceptable to talk to the ANC. And I think that was a major advance at that point. Although now one has also got to factor in that unbeknown to the Dakar delegation, the National Party has already started putting out feelers as far as the ANC is concerned. People like Neil Barnard and others. And the difference was that the National Party obviously had the power at the time, whilst the Slubbert delegation had no real power. Their achievement was, I would like to say, is more of a symbolic nature than it carried any real conviction in terms of a power shift. Although it did change the way in which connections with the ANC were viewed and the way in which discussions with the ANC has become acceptable.
Yes, and the ANC were no longer seen as devils with horns. He, of course, Van Zyl himself famously was really taken in by Thabo Mbeki. They developed a close relationship. They had similar academic interests. And he said, I would die for that bugger.
Precisely, they got like a house on fire. I think there was a certain chemistry at work there. Both had an intellectual bent, and both had a sense of humor. And at that time, Slubbert didn't take him. Slubbert had a sort of self-deprecating manner at times,
Yes.
and Mbeki also at times. That situation changed, of course, once Mbeki assumed power and became vice president. So then the whole relationship soured. But yeah, at Dakar, as you say, it was a very warm friendship that developed there.
Do you think that Thabo Mbeki was very calculating? I mean, I think it's logical to assume that he was very calculating and he was using this opportunity to build a relationship that he may not have intended to keep.
Yes, that's an intriguing question, and I haven't got a clear-cut answer to that. But I'm careful of saying that he was just purely opportunistic. He and Slubbert did actually get along, and Slubbert was also a good judge of people. I think he wouldn't have been as fond of Mbeki if he had an inkling that he's just being used. It turned out in the long run, of course, then there were different factors coming into play. But at that point, I think there was a genuine friendship and that it wasn't all opportunistic. But at the same time, there were people like Mac Maraz, which paraded claiming that he's being assaulted by the security police and he walked with a limp. And all of that was just theater. But Mbeki, I think, was more honest in what he conveyed.
Yes. Yes, I remember that with Maharaj, although Maharaj said he was doing it at the time to cover up for the fact that he'd been in Vietnam. So he had to disappear for a while. And his explanation was to create that fiction.
Yeah, precisely. Yeah.
But of course, the Mbeki Slubbert relationship is the key one here, I think. And of course, Van Zyl, when he was asked for advice by Mbeki, he said, get yourself a team of people who tell you who are really bright and very skilled in their fields, and have them meet with you and tell you how stupid you are. And of course, that was perhaps an unfortunate use of terminology. I mean, knowing Slubbert, it had no unfortunate intention. But Mbeki was very sensitive, and that was the sort of thing that he couldn't get past.
Yes, he took great umbrage, and there was sort of, although Slubbert didn't mean it, of course, there was an underlying racial tone to it, which Mbeki picked up, and he felt that was unbecoming of Slubbert to behave in such a way, that it was inappropriate. But then one has got to push it a bit further as well, despite what I said earlier, and I still stand with that as far as the car is concerned. But later on as well, one has got to factor in that Slubbert was quite a gregarious person and a wonderful sense of interacting with people. Whilst Mbeki, in some respects, were much more clinical and withdrawn, and that became more pronounced once he'd become a vice president. So that kind of personality differences differentiated out more starkly than was the situation earlier on.
Yes, I think that's right. That was certainly my sense of Van Zyl Slabbert. In the few minutes we have left for this segment, we will have one more segment, I wanted to move to his role in the Progressive Federal Party just briefly, because in a way I thought he moved the party. It was under his lead, a commission he led, asked by Colin Eglinton, that the party for the first time accepted one person, one vote.
precisely that, which is actually quite surprising if one thinks that the Liberal Party had that position
Qualified
far earlier. Yeah, but the PFP at that point still had a qualified franchise. So yeah, Slubbert did that, and he kept on shifting his position. Initially, he had sort of a number of built-in checks and balances, but eventually said just one person, one vote in a unitary system. He didn't pursue the federal option with any intent.
Yes, that's right. And of course, when he left the Parliament, obviously that caused tensions, as you would expect. I don't want to start another subject yet, because we've got to take a quick break. When we come back, I want to ask you about the Slubbert Commission into electoral systems, because as we know, the Constitution required that the proportional representation system we use now be reviewed, and Slubbert was appointed by the government to review it, but ultimately his recommendation was ignored. We'll be right back talking to Professor Albert Grundlingh. And we're back talking to Professor Grundlingh about his new book, Slubbert, Man on a Mission. Albert, I'm not sure how far you go in this, but it seems to me that the Slubbert Commission came up with a sound alternative, because, I mean, our proportional representation system is arguably one of the biggest flaws in an otherwise excellent constitution, because accountability of our MPs is so limited nowadays. We have protests all over the country, and yet you don't see people going to the MP to help them. His proposal was ignored, but it's still the modern idea of what an election system should be, isn't it?
Yes, that's right. And I think it's one of the unrecognized legacies of Slubbert. And it goes back much earlier, as you suggested, the 78, 79 proposals he put before the PFP. That was the first time that there was some serious discussions about moving away completely from the existing constitution and formulating a new constitution. The Nats played around with adapting the system through the tricameral parliament, but not getting a completely new system. And that was Slubbert's, I think that's one of his greatest legacies, that he started right earlier on, also changing the grammar of understanding in Parliament, that they shouldn't be talking about inter-white issues, they should be talking about serious matters like apartheid, which affected the country as a whole. And then in 2003 with the Electoral Commission, I actually think he was a bit led up the garden path there. He thought this was a serious intent. But Mbeki dragged his feet about appointing people, and there was some reluctance to get the thing off the ground. And eventually Carter Osmal, although he claims the opposite, he just canned the proposals. And those proposals, they got an uncanny likeness to what is being promoted more currently.
Well, yes, I mean, the idea, I've seen this internationally as well, the idea that you need a mixed system, that a pure constituency, one person per constituency is not ideal, but if you have a way to hold people accountable through either a number of MPs per constituency, a mixed system that includes some people elected in another way, you'll get better accountability.
Yeah, it's got to go across the board. You've got to have more options to affect some sense of accountability. Yeah.
Right. Now, the other issue I wanted to raise with you is, I mean, when you think of it, the dilemma he had once he left the Parliament, you describe, I think you quote someone saying he was in a no man's land. In a way, it's the no man's land that many well-meaning whites find themselves in now, isn't it? That you may have skills, you want to deliver them, you don't want to join the ANC, which of course was his determination, and he thought he could play a part without being in the ANC, and obviously the ANC made it clear that that wasn't going to happen. So there are people who have skills, who feel they have something to offer. They don't necessarily want a title or a lot of money, but they've got to feel valued, and I think by the end he didn't feel valued.
Precisely, and I think that got him. There wasn't even, although he got in 2014, Zuma gave him some kind of government award,
Yes.
but that was purely symbolic, and
Yes.
4 years after his death. But otherwise, he did feel that that his contributions weren't sufficiently acknowledged. But he never allowed that really to get to him too much, and because he was always operating on a different level, and political accolades didn't mean that much to him as it did to some other politicians. And I think he realized that quite early on, and you would know that from your book on the South African Broadcasting Corporation. How Slubbert was drawn in to be a chairperson of the committee, and then Mandela insisted that he shouldn't be doing that, that he should resign. So really at that point, there was an awareness, he was aware of the fact that his services wouldn't necessarily be appreciated by the new ruling party.
I want to move on, of course, because he did many other things after that, including becoming chancellor of Stellenbosch University. Now, he'd been a student there, he was a rugby player, he was very popular. But I want to ask you, how did the Stellenbosch establishment reconcile with Van Zyl Slabbert? Because he was very critical of the establishment, he was very critical of the Broederbond and its role in the university, and yet he became an adored leader by the end.
Yeah, I think one must allow for the fact that the time span that has elapsed. Slubbert eventually came home to quite a different Stellenbosch than the one he initially enrolled in. And Slubbert also always had a kind of soft spot for Stellenbosch. Despite its conservatism at the time, there were little groupings of people who were much more critical, not necessarily in classes, although some of them were in classes as well, but discussion groups which went way beyond what the National Party was prepared to countenance at the time. And Slubbert was influenced by these kinds of discussions, and he valued the kind of experiences he had on that level. So he had a positive view of Stellenbosch, and despite the Broederbond, and he stood up against the Broederbond, and he stood up against the apartheid system, also by analyzing it analytically. And he realized that gave him an opportunity to match his wits against those of his National Party peers. And he was a competitive man, and so he felt that was one of the good elements that Stellenbosch imparted. Of course, when he became chancellor of the university, Stellenbosch has shifted, and it wasn't really a problem to getting accepted as a chancellor, and he was a highly valued chancellor, but unfortunately, at that point, he was already quite ill, and that detracted a bit from, or detracted considerably from his tenure as a chancellor.
Finally, I want to ask, what was his ideology? My understanding is that he saw himself as a social democrat.
Broadly speaking, yes. One can also argue that he was still imbued with a sense of liberalism, but liberalism adapted to African realities. One talks about straight ideology. or liberal ideology. It had to be tweaked to fit into a new environment. And I agree with you that broadly speaking, he was a social democrat. Although interestingly enough, and I found that doing the biography as well, it's only occasionally that he spoke about economics. He didn't pay that much attention to economics, which is a bit strange. But when he did, one can surely say that it fell squarely within the social democratic mode.
Which means he saw a stronger role for government. He wouldn't have been totally at one with people who want all state enterprises privatized. I think he would have taken things much more on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah, precisely. He wasn't in favor of unfettered capitalism. That he made quite clear.
What do you? What is there is now an institute in his name. Just before we end, what is the purpose of the institute, and how does it? What does it mean for South Africa?
Yeah, this is Fansel Slubbert Institute for Student Leadership, and it's been founded in his honor. And of course, there's a yearly honorary lecture. But the idea is to train students to interact with each other on different stratas or different areas, to train them for leadership, not only at university, but also make them aware of leadership challenges in the future. That's a basic point of departure.
Right. Professor Grundlingh, the book is very interesting. I mean, Van Zyl Slabbert was once the golden boy of South African politics, and it's worth knowing where he comes from. We're out of time, but thanks for joining us, and look forward to seeing you next week.